Good morning, everyone. Today is another episode of Kwentong Likas Yaman, and we have a special guest from abroad. He will be introduced by my partner, Doc Leppy. Doc Leppy.
Hi, everyone. Hi, beloved and faithful listeners to Kwentong Likas Yaman. It is indeed a great pleasure to be with you once again this beautiful Wednesday morning. Indeed, I am truly personally excited because of our guest today. Let me have the honors of introducing a long friend, kind of an idol, one who has mentored many of us, Dr. Larry Heaney, or Lawrence Heaney. He was born in Washington, D.C., and he attended the University of Minnesota as an undergraduate and the University of Kansas for his master's and PhD studies. Actually, he finished his master's with honors. He began his career in biodiversity studies as a volunteer at the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. It was while in the Smithsonian Institution that he developed his twin research interest in the biology of mammals and the evolution of biological diversity on islands. His project in the Philippines since 1981 has been conducted in collaboration with museums, universities, conservation organizations, and government agencies. In fact, it was along that time period that I met him. I think that was already in the 90s, early 90s. He has, after serving on the faculty of the Museum of Zoology and Department of Biology at the University of Michigan, he returned to the Smithsonian Institution for several years and then moved to the Field Museum of Natural History in 1988. He has conducted field research in many parts of the United States, but he focused much of his research on mammals in the Philippines, where the density of mammalian endemic species is among the highest globally. This he has always emphasized and reiterated every time he would give us his inspiring and encouraging messages in promoting biodiversity research in this country. His research deals with the long-term evolutionary, ecological, and geological factors that influence patterns of biodiversity and endemism in oceanic archipelagos in collaboration with a wide range of researchers, conservationists, government officials here in the Philippines as well as in the US. In fact, I was also part of one of his research team that stayed up or climbed Mount Kitanglad for almost a month. Much of his research has contributed to the development of a community of conservation-related biologists in the Philippines, including myself again. He has trained dozens of young Filipino biologists in the Philippines and the US, and he is also the founder, and also we call him father of the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines, which is now the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. His research projects and discovery of over 4 decades has described and named more or less 40 previously unknown species and recovery of others, and has contributed substantially to the conservation programs that guided in the establishment and development of protected areas and parks. Dr. Larry is the Nagauni Curator of Mammals at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. He teaches, advises, inspires, mentors, and leads students into good substantial research, meaningful research at the University of Chicago, as well as in the University of the Philippines, and is a research fellow at the Philippine National Museum of Natural History. Indeed, we have a great person with us today, and we will learn much from him. Let's listen to the first question coming from JD. But of course, his greetings first. Doc Larry, greet our audience, please.
Well, I'm delighted to join you. That was an extremely generous and long introduction. I want to thank you for that. I think you've covered much of my talk.
Anyways, okay, so I'll be the one to ask the first question, and the title of this episode is The Philippines, Galapagos Islands 10 Times. And it was described by you, right, Dr. Heaney? So I would like you to explain some more on why that particular statement, that the Philippines is Galapagos Island 10 times.
Well, so for biologists who are interested in biological diversity, and pretty much anything regarding the history of what we know about biological diversity, if you mention islands, what they are likely to think of first in most countries is the Galapagos Islands. That's where Charles Darwin developed initially his ideas about natural selection. It's where a lot of really classical research has been done on biological diversity and how it develops over time. And it's a wonderful place. But the Philippines is vastly better in all respects, much more diverse. I can show you some slides that show you a little bit about this. It's just a much more important globally place than the Galapagos, and vastly more interesting to do research in. So we can talk about some of that. What you see here is a standard map of Southeast Asia showing the Philippines. It's a set of islands off the coast of the continent and north of the often larger islands down in Indonesia. That's the image that most people pull to mind when they think of the Philippines in a geographic context. But that's really, for a biologist, somewhat misleading because it doesn't tell you most of the most important things about the Philippines and biological diversity. So if we can go to the next slide. So just a couple of major points here, and we're going to come back to most of these as we go along. So the Philippines we need to think of as not just being a part of Asia, and a set of islands near the continent, but really in many respects it is so distinctive, so unusual, so rich in unique biological diversity that it needs to be thought of as almost a world apart. It is absolutely unique. And in fact, what makes it so distinctive, so unique, is the fact that it is not just a single center of biological diversity, the way most countries are, in fact, even as most continents are, but many, many, many unique areas of biological diversity. And that is genuinely unique. Mm-hmm. Okay, so as implied by that, the plants and animals that live in the Philippines are not just more of the same kinds of things that occur in the Asian continental areas, but there are many entirely unique entire branches of the tree of life that live only in the Philippines. And we'll mention a couple of those as we go along. Mm-hmm. So, and the islands themselves are not just, more islands, but in fact, they are some of the oldest and largest islands in the world. That's not something that I think is widely appreciated even within the Philippines. Mm-hmm. And the islands are not just islands as we usually think about them, but they're also what we call sky islands. We can come back and talk about that later. I think that often people have the impression that we already know everything about biological diversity, that it's just there, you can look it up online, it's all available, it's been done. Well, that is absolutely not the case. People literally make major new discoveries in the Philippines every year, and it seems as though it happens every day. And that's one of the most exciting things about being involved with research in the Philippines. There's just so much new information coming out all the time. So those are some of the points that we'll hit as we go along. So one of the questions that we sometimes ask is, well, what is it that makes the Philippines a particularly interesting place to study mammalian diversity?
Yeah.
So we showed you the map of the current political situation in Southeast Asia. For someone who's interested in biodiversity, this is a much more important map. This shows what the dry land areas were about 12 to 14,000 years ago, back to about 20,000 years ago, when sea levels were about 120 meters lower than they are right now. So when the northern continents were covered by glaciers, the water that made up those glaciers had evaporated out of the world's oceans. And as the glaciers built up, sea level went down. So the result of this was that, well, if you look at the center of this map at Borneo, you can see that there was dry land extending all the way up into Indochina to Thailand and Vietnam. There was dry land going over to Sumatra and Java. But heading off to the east and the north, there were sea channels cutting through. So if you go to Borneo today and compare the mammals that are there to the mammals that are on, say, Sumatra, they're very similar, very, very similar, lots of shared species. If instead you go from Borneo to Mindanao or Luzon, they're almost completely different. It's closer from Borneo to Mindanao or Luzon than it is to Sumatra, and yet the animals are far, far more different. The reason for that is that most animals don't swim all that well. They have a hard time crossing even narrow sea channels, and there were sea channels that remained in here throughout that period of low sea level. So one of the things that I know people thought was the case for a long, long time was that the Philippines had been connected by dry land to Taiwan and to Borneo at various points in the past. Well, we learn things over time. And in the last, in recent years, the amount of new information about the geological history of the Philippines has increased really dramatically. And we now know that there have not ever been dry land connections from the majority of the Philippines to anywhere else in the world. The Philippines has always been a uniquely distinct group of islands. That's really cool. That's exciting. That's a big part of what makes it a world apart and makes it 10 times the Galapagos.
So Dr. Heaney, your focus in coming into the Philippines is really about mammals. Can you describe what are mammals? Although that's a general question, but for the sake of our audience, kindly provide us a description of mammals, its biology, taxonomy,
Sure.
all those. Thank
Sure.
you.
Sure. Okay. Well, Letty, why don't you go to the next slide, and I'll give you a little bit. Whoa. So just a pretty picture. So this is the way that I think about the Philippines.
Beautiful.
Yeah, spectacular. So this is a photograph taken from the top of Mount Isarog in Bicol, looking down toward Mount Mayon. That's the one with the perfect cone there.
I thought this was a painting.
No, that's a real photograph.
Very nice.
Yeah. Our friend Danny Balete took that photo. So this is a good way to think about the Philippines. The country is mostly volcanic in origin. The volcanoes are caused by major movements of the plates that make up the Earth's surface over the surface of the globe. The Philippines is a place where there's a lot of geological activity. And that geological activity is what generates the volcanoes. Now, if we go to the next slide.
Okay.
All right, so here's what the Philippines looked like during that last ice age. You can see that there are lots of islands that remained during the Ice Age. Up in the north, Luzon Island, as we think of it today, is shown in dark green. It expanded out to include several, smaller nearby islands, but remained separate from all of the other islands. Mindoro remained isolated. The channel between Mindoro and Luzon was pretty narrow, but it was deep and the water moved fast. Heading down to the south, Mindanao expanded out to include Leyte and Samar and Bohol, other smaller islands, but didn't merge up with Luzon and didn't merge with Borneo. And then lots of other islands scattered around the country remained separate also. So next slide. Okay, so we're getting closer to answering your question here. All right, so here's the result of that for mammals. So up in Luzon, Greater Luzon, that island that existed just, 12 to 20,000 years ago. The islands that make that up, there we know now of 56 species of mammals that are native, that, developed there, not brought in by people, that do not fly. So bats have somewhat different patterns of distribution. Of those 56 species, 52 of them, 93%, occur nowhere else in the world. Not even in the rest of the Philippines. 93%, nowhere else in the world. There are very, very few countries in the world that have 52 species of mammals that occur nowhere else. And that's just Luzon.
Endemic to Luzon only. That?
Sorry?
That was endemic only to Luzon.
Endemic only to Luzon. They occur nowhere else in the world. Mindoro, it's not a huge island. There are 16 species of native non-flying mammals that we know of there. 75% of those occur only on Mindoro. Down in the south, Greater Mindanao, we know of 41 species right now, more discoveries all the time. 93% of those occur nowhere else in the world, not even elsewhere in the Philippines. So the Philippines is not a single area of biodiversity. It is many areas of biodiversity. Even the little islands like Sibuyan, which, a lot of people in the Philippines have never even heard of, has 5 species of mammals that occur nowhere else. There are no countries in continental Europe that have 5 unique species of mammals. No countries in Europe. And yet, there are lots of places in the Philippines, places that are, islands that are so small that people haven't even heard of them that have that many. So it really is genuinely unique. Okay, now.
Dr. Larry, first I would like to ask, what do you mean by non-volant mammals?
Yeah, sorry. So that means non-flying,
Okay.
not capable of flight. So it's the technical term that we use to refer to mammals that are not bats.
Yeah, because I understand that it's not as a mainstream term yet, no?
Yeah, sorry about that.
So flying mammals are volant, while non-volant are non-flying mammals.
Yep.
Thank you for that.
Okay. Okay, so before I go on, any comments or questions about this? All right, so the volant mammals. So most people in the Philippines are aware that there are bats around. There are 70 species, at least 70 species of bats that live in the Philippines. Tremendously diverse. These are drawings of one individual of each of the families of bats that live in the Philippines. So not just 7 species, but much, much larger groups. So for example, water buffalo and African antelope, and lots of other kinds of things are all members of a single family. Dogs and wolves and foxes are all members of a single family. Tigers and house cats are members of a single family. So each one of these represents an entire family, each of which is represented in the Philippines. And the ones that are there are just outstanding. So the bottom left corner there, that is a golden-crowned flying fox. By weight, those are the largest bats in the world. They weigh up to 1.4 kilos. They're the size of a, fairly average house cat.
Yeah.
They've got a wingspan of about 5 feet, which is what, about 80 centimeters? These are huge bats. They are fabulous things. There's a colony of them that lives out in Subic. I've been told that they're not in the easiest place to see anymore. They used to be very conspicuous. But if you can find them and you go out in the evening and you watch them as they begin to fly, you will also see as these huge bats come out and, they don't go flutter, flutter. They go whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Flying among them, you will see these little bitty things that look kind of like moths. Mm-hmm. Those are bats also. So that tiny little image that's just above the golden-crowned flying fox, that is can you see that there, Letty?
What?
Yes, that one. Yep. That is a lesser flat-headed bamboo bat.
Yeah. They
are so tiny that they can crawl through cracks and holes in the stem of bamboo and roost inside there and raise their babies in there. And they have a wingspan about, I don't know if you can see my hands, but about like that.
Yeah.
Tiny, tiny little things. So you can see what we think is the largest bat in the world and one of the smallest in the world at the same time. If you go out to Subic Bay and you're lucky and you get there at the right time. So mammals, as you can see from this, have a couple of characteristics that define them. One is they have all mammals have at least some hair at some point during their lifetime. Whales have a little bit of hair when they're born, and they lose the hair soon thereafter. There are other things that manatees and dugongs and such don't have much in the way of hair, but they've got some whiskers. They've all got hair. Also, all mammals, the mothers feed their young on milk that they produce. That is distinctive for mammals. And nearly all mammals give birth to live young. There are a couple of species in Australia and New Guinea that actually lay eggs, and the eggs hatch shortly after they are born, laid, whatever, and then develop the same way that other mammals do. So these are animals that all share a common ancestor. If you go back 100 million years or more, have developed over time. Bats are one group of mammals. They are among the most diverse globally. Philippines is definitely a hotspot for diversity. Others that are in the Philippines, I think, are on some of the next slides. And a bushy-tailed giant cloud rat. I would have to say this is my favorite Philippine mammal. They are just fabulous. They only live up in the Central Cordillera, up at the highest elevations, up where it's very, very cool, cold, and very wet in the cloud forest up there, the fog forest. Fantastic.
This is the Crateromys, right? The
Yep.
one equivalent of the Phloemis here in southern Luzon, which is not as bushy-tailed as this one.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So let's try the next slide and see if that's what I think it is.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So cloud rats. So the one, Letty, that you were just talking about is in the bottom right-hand corner.
Here.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's a giant cloud rat. They're in the lowlands all over Luzon. There are two species. One of them is pretty common in the area around Los Baños. And
Yes.
I'm told by various friends there that they occasionally wander into people's houses on campus there.
They lived in my attic, in the house, in my house in the forestry then.
Fantastic. That's wonderful. These are seriously cool animals. So the one on the far right is the bushy-tailed cloud rat, the one that I was holding. So those they're well over a meter long from the tip of the nose to the tip of the tail. A lot of that is tail, but it's a big animal. So these cloud rats, we have learned relatively recently, are one of these branches on the tree of life that lives only in the Philippines. So all of these animals that you see in this slide are members of this one group that have evolved in the Philippines. They live nowhere else in the world. Their common ancestor, arrived from the Asian mainland, we think about 14 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the really fantastic things about Philippine biodiversity. The origins of the animals that live there is so ancient. They've been uniquely Filipino for 14 million years.
Yeah, I'm curious about this picture. There is a black, there is one with a white stripe, and there is a gray. Is this the young form or juvenile form, or is it a distinct adult also?
It's a color morph. There's just variation in the coat color in the same way that there is in pet rabbits would be pretty similar. And the bushy tail, or the giant cloud rats that are down around Los Baños, or at least the one that's shown here, there's a fair amount of variation in their coloration also. There's some of them that are almost entirely silver, others that are mostly brown, a lot of variation. That's something that nobody has studied yet. Would be
So
really
you mean, Dr. Larry, that this species here, the 5 genera and 21 species, were new discoveries?
Some of them were, yeah. And so, so in fact, so the bigger ones have been known for 120 years or so, something like that, occasionally a little longer than that. But a fair number. So right now we know of 21 species of cloud rats. 3 of them are species that we just described that are known only from fossils, from archaeological sites. The oldest ones in the archaeological record are about 65,000 years old. So we know that they were around from that point up until about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, at which point they disappeared.
Yeah, I remember when I started getting involved with wildlife studies, we knew about 6 or 7 species of cloud rats. Just that. It was even placed in the poster by William Oliver, right? Only in the Philippines poster. Now there are 21 of them, and the cloud rats just were giant cloud rats. Now we have dwarf cloud rats and other variations.
Yeah.
So these were new discoveries, Dr. Larry?
Yeah, some, not all of them, but some of them definitely. So that drawing of the bushy-tailed cloud rats, if you look in the upper right-hand corner,
upper right-hand corner
of
this
that
one?
drawing, yeah, keep going up to the upper right-hand corner.
There.
There, yes.
I did not notice. Sorry. Okay.
Little red mouse.
Yeah.
So that is we somewhat jokingly refer to that as a micro dwarf giant cloud rat. Since they're all giant cloud rats, right? So this is a micro dwarf giant cloud rat. It's an animal that we discovered first on Mount Banahao about 15 years ago. named it not only as a new species, but as a new genus. So the next level up above the species. And subsequently discovered 3 more members that are of that genus, things that are closely related to that first one. This is it's a tiny little mouse, but when you compare the anatomy or the DNA, it's very clear that it is closely related to Crateromys, this massive cloud rat. And there's this tiny little one that's just a little version of it. Wonderful little animal. They're up in the mossy forest up high. They're active only at night. They live up in the trees. They eat seeds and such things. They're in a place where it's foggy much of the time, very, very wet habitat. So they actually find their way around in the treetops, mostly with their whiskers. Their whiskers are so long that they reach to their hind feet.
Oh, long, really long. Okay. I wonder, what binds the cloud rats together, the DNA or the habitat or the distribution?
Well, the anatomy and the DNA helps us to define the history of who they're related to. And that's the primary basis for deciding how we define a cloud rat. But it is also true that they all live up in the treetops most of the time. They all eat only plants. Most of them live up in the cloud forest, which is how they got the name originally. There are a couple of them like the giant cloud rats that you see on campus at Los Baños that also occur down in the lowlands.
Yeah. Yes, the kumingay, the phloemis. But I just love watching it crunching on carrots and on sayote. Any leaf or vegetable that crunches, it just loves them. It's really very vegetarian.
Yeah.
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 Do I move to the next slide or yeah?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so another one of these unique branches of mammalian life that lives entirely only in the Philippines are the ones that we now refer to as earthworm mice, because in fact they eat mostly earthworms, which is pretty weird for a mouse, and yet that's what they eat. They'll also eat snails and crickets, and some of them occasionally will eat a little frog or something like that. But they are almost entirely mice that feed on other living things, not plants, other animals, and mostly earthworms. They absolutely.
Yeah, Dr. Larry, let me clarify. It used to be the shrews are the animal eating. They feed on insects and earthworms or other small invertebrates. But these ones, the shrews are different from these mice, right?
Yes.
So they are different. These are really murids. And yes, they are now a distinct group that you have classified. These are part of your new discovery and descriptions, because there was not much of these earthworm eating mice in the past that I knew, no? When I started studying wildlife.
When you and I were both starting to study mammals in the Philippines, we only know about, maybe 15 species in this group. And now it's way over 40. Tremendous number of new species that have been discovered, and more of them all the time. Literally, more of them all the time.
So, Dr. Larry, what do you think is the significance of your discoveries of these new species, and can you relate it to the conditions of the country's environment?
So, well, yes. So there are a number of things that we can conclude from this. One is just that there is a tremendous level of biological diversity that constitutes a big part of the natural heritage of the Philippines. And they're so distinctive, so different from anything anywhere else that it's a justifiable reason for a lot of national pride. And I think that's important. But they also tell us a lot about the habitats that exist in the Philippines, how many of them there are and how they function. Well, actually, in fact, I think the next slide.
Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's important about the Philippines is that although most people live in the lowlands, meaning, you know, below, say, 800 meters or so in elevation, and an awful lot of people live, you know, relatively near the shoreline. The Philippines is actually very, very mountainous. In fact, the way that geographers define these things, the Philippines is one of the most mountainous countries in the world. Well, that has a big impact on the environment. So this is a diagram that shows a typical mountain on Luzon. In fact, one of the taller ones that would go up to maybe 3,000 meters or so, which is Mount Pulag. I think most people know that if you go from Manila at sea level up to Baguio, which is at about 1,200 meters, it's much cooler up there. So if it's 30 degrees centigrade in Manila, in Baguio on that same day, it's likely to be 24, maybe 22 degrees, something like that. It's a lot cooler up there. Well, if you keep going up higher and higher in elevation, it continues to get cooler and cooler and cooler. So up near the top of Mount Pulag, it's rare that it gets any more than 15 degrees. And there are a lot of days up there when the high is 8. I've been up there spending a fair amount of time doing survey work, and it's cold up there. But so there's something else that happens also, and that's probably familiar to people who spent time in Baguio. It rains more up there. So as you go up in elevation and as the air gets cooler and cooler, warm air can hold more moisture in a gaseous state than cold air can. So as you go up in elevation and all the air is moving up and cooling off, there's condensation that takes place. Clouds form and it rains, fog forms. So it's not just cooler in Baguio, it's also wetter. So average rainfall, you know, there's a lot of variation, but average rainfall in the Philippines in the lowlands is about 2 meters. Up in the area around Baguio, typically it is closer to 3 meters. And if you keep going up in elevation, there are a lot of places where it's 5 meters of rain per year. And there are some places high in the mountains in the Philippines that get 8 meters of rain in a year. So during the dry season and when the rivers continue to carry water, that's where the water is coming from. These are really critically important areas as watersheds.
Yeah.
So
it's also related to what you have described as sky islands, the altitudinal differentiation of the temperature as you go up.
Yes. So let's go to the next slide. I think that will help with that question. There you go. Okay, so here's a map of Luzon and Mindoro showing the mountainous areas. So, okay, so these are mountains, familiar. So can you point to Manila Bay there, Letty? Yeah, there you go. That's Manila Bay.
Okay.
Yep. Oops, you had it. Okay. So in the mountains just above Manila Bay are the mountains in the Zambales range. And then way up to the north is the Central Cordillera, where Baguio is. Other mountain ranges scattered around, they're isolated. These are places, each one of those mountain ranges is, I mean, it's a mountain, it goes up to high elevation. So on each one of those mountain ranges, there are places that are much cooler and much wetter than the surrounding habitat. So these are, in effect, islands of mossy forest habitat. So each one of those is what we now refer to as being a sky island.
Mm.
So Luzon is not only an island in its own right, it supports a great many sky islands. And
So
each one of
the possibility is every peak of every mountain or mountain range can be a possible sky island because they
Yes.
are distinct from one another.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And each one of them is a unique center of biological diversity for mammals. So go to the next slide, I think. Oh, so that's what it looks like.
Beautiful.
Isn't that fabulous?
Yeah.
Awesome. Really.
Yeah. So just take a look at that. There's so much fog and rain that the plants can grow on the tree branches as what are called epiphytes. So there are bird's nest ferns and orchids and begonias and rafflesia and all of the other things that people like to keep as houseplants growing all over the place up on these trees. And the ground is covered with moss. And the moss builds up over time into these layers that can be anywhere from, a quarter of a meter to 2 or 3 meters thick. This layer of partially decomposed moss and dead leaves and dead branches and live roots and all of that. So it's just like a gigantic layer of sponge.
Mm-hmm.
So when it rains up here, there is no runoff of water on the surface. It just goes right straight into this gigantic sponge and is then slowly released over time, much of which then is the source of the water in the lowlands during the dry season.
Yeah.
So it's really a critically important part of the human environment, even though not very few people live up there. It's the source of much of the water that people depend on all over the Philippines. And it's the place where a lot of these unique species of mammals live. So try one more slide. Let's see what happens here. There we go. Okay. So sky islands. So it was only in the very late 1990s that we realized that there were a lot of species that live only up in these isolated areas that are cold and wet at the tops of the mountains. So in the year 2000, the map that's on the left there, we knew of 28 species of native non-flying, non-bat mammals on Luzon Island. 20 of those occurred only on Luzon, so 71%. And you can see that, for example, there were quite a few known from the Central Cordillera, only one from the Zambales Mountains north of Manila, a few down, a few down on Mount Isarog, way down in Bicol, 3 of them known down there from some research that Professor Robor had done. He was based at UP Los Baños at the time. So in the year 2000, my many collaborators and I began working on studies of mammals, doing a lot of field work up in these sky islands. And the map on the right now shows the number of species that we know in each one of these sky island areas. So the Central Cordillera, we now know of 14 rather than just 10. In the Sierra Madre, rather than 2, we now know of 4, plus the 3 extinct ones that disappeared only very recently. The Zambales Mountains, 4. The Mingan Mountains, how many people have heard of the Mingan Mountains? That's a distinct sky island area in Aurora province. Mm-hmm. There are 4 species of mammals that live nowhere else in the world. There is 1 country in Europe that has 4 unique species of mammals. Spain is the only one. And yet, the tiny little Mingan Mountains there in Aurora have 4 that live nowhere else in the world. The Philippines really is an extraordinary place. Mount Banahao just south of Manila, down near near Los Baños.
Mm.
Down a little further. There you go, south of the lake there. There you go. Mount Banahao, we now know there are 4 species of mammals that live only there. Down in Bicol, the area around Mount Isarog, there are 8 species that live down there on those high peaks and nowhere else in the world. So in terms of understanding biological diversity of mammals in the Philippines, these sky islands prove to be extremely important. As a result of doing these studies, we now know of 56 species that occur on Luzon, or on Luzon, and of those, 52 occur nowhere else in the world. So as a result of this research, we literally have doubled the number of native non-bat species living on Luzon Island, making it one of the most mammalian-rich parts of the world.
Wow. I can only say wow. The same is happening with the herps.
Yeah, yes. Reptiles and amphibians, the story plays out differently because they tend to be mostly in the lowlands, although there are a lot of frogs up high too. It's very similar with earthworms, studies that people are doing currently. It's the same for many, many, many species of plants. We're learning that some populations of birds up at these high elevation areas are quite distinct also, where it hadn't been apparent previously. So the more groups of organisms, plants and animals you include, the more variation there is in how the story plays out. But the basic pattern is very, very similar for all biological diversity. Yeah, so this is just I thought you might be interested to see just where the field work was done. So these are the yellow dots show our primary intensive survey areas during this period from 2000 to 2012. Approximately 40 team months of time living in camps up in the mountains. Much of the time, our teams were led by, the field teams were led by our good friend and colleague, Danny Valete, who is a really extraordinary biologist. Absolutely loved doing field work, could identify virtually every species of plant or animal that he encountered. Amazing knowledge of biodiversity. And wrote and published a great many papers. Danny unfortunately passed away very suddenly about 4 years ago. Tremendous loss to Philippine biodiversity studies overall. Yeah, next slide. And I think, yeah. So 28 new species discovered on Luzon in a period of field work over 12 years. We're still working on getting all of it published. This set of drawings shows just some of the diversity of the species that were discovered during the course of this. They're all mice. Lots of them don't look much like mice. They don't act like mice. That's really an amazing radiation. And the little guy it's my hand, the photo in the bottom left, that's the micro dwarf giant cloud rat from Mount Banahao.
Sooner or later, you'll have a nano micro giant. Okay. Side question. I wonder why most of your pictures of the mammals are in illustrations or drawings, not much of photographs.
Yeah. So there are a number of reasons for that. One is that unlike plants that hold still for you, and frogs that you can, kind of cool them down so that they aren't very active and get good photos. Lots of other things, birds that perch nicely during the daytime. Most of these animals are active at night. And it is really, 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 really hard to get photographs of them in the wild. Mostly you just get a blur and nothing else.
Yeah.
But also one of the advantages of the drawings is that you can show the appearance of the animal very precisely and do it in a consistent way that makes it possible for somebody who's trying to identify one of these animals in the field to be able to look at the drawing and say, oh, I see. Here are the differences between this one and the one that is related that lives nearby. The drawings are a really good way to go. And we're fortunate to have a very talented illustrator working with us on the project.
Okay, so
Doc Larry, I'm curious about the IUCN status of our Philippine mammal endemic species. Can you describe the status of those that were discovered before? Maybe these new ones. I'm not sure if you already have a description of their IUCN status.
Well, so the whole issue of conservation status is a really important one, obviously. In general terms, what we have learned is that there are two major factors that are usually involved in a species becoming endangered. One of them is habitat destruction. These are animals that have evolved to live in certain kinds of natural habitats, usually some kind of forest in the Philippines, since most of the country was originally covered by forest. So when that habitat is either significantly degraded or removed entirely and replaced with agricultural areas or urban areas or anything of that sort, they simply aren't able to survive. So habitat destruction is a really important one. The other is hunting. And right now, at this time, so in the past, habitat destruction was the single biggest factor, removing much of the forest. So the Philippines was, a couple thousand years ago was 95% forested. The amount of old growth forest, good quality old growth forest now is probably somewhere around 6, 7, maybe 8% of the country. So a tremendous reduction in the original habitat. But because of all of the economic changes that have taken place over the last 30 years or so, essentially since the people power revolution that ended the Marcos era, the economy has improved substantially. And although there are tremendous problems that the country is facing, an awful lot of people have moved into urban areas, and whether they're large cities or small towns, fewer and fewer people living up in the hills trying to make a living as a subsistence farmer. So the result of that is that the amount of second growth forest has increased. And so it's actually up now to maybe 12%. So, something on the order of 24 to 26% maybe of the country is covered by something that looks like reasonable forest. So right now at this moment, we're still dealing with the legacy of past habitat destruction, but it's a less important issue right now than overhunting. So the species that are most severely threatened right now among mammals are the large mammals like the native deer and the native pigs that are very heavily hunted. Unfortunately, temorao are still hunted. The cloud rats are still hunted. And perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the bats are very, very heavily hunted.
Yes.
So they, that some of them roost in trees and big colonies out where you can see them, and people will hunt them with shotguns. You can also catch bats. Some people catch them in in fish nets that are hung in places where the bats are flying by. But an awful lot of the hunting goes on in caves where some of the bats roost. People will go into the caves and build a fire, and the smoke fills the upper part of the cave, and the bats die from lack of oxygen. They fall down to the cave floor. People pick them up and they eat them as pulutan.
Yes, it's very sad, and I hope the listeners, at this point in what you are sharing, would be influenced, with this situation that it's really important to protect our forest and our
Yeah.
natural resources in general.
So Letty, if you go to the next slide, I think
Okay.
it's, yeah.
There.
So yes, these the habitat destruction and overhunting have a huge impact on the biodiversity, but they also have a huge impact on people. Logging in the Philippines at this point makes almost no sense at all, other than under very, very specific, very well-defined and controlled circumstances. And the reason is the Philippines is mountainous, and there aren't forests left in flat lowland areas. So when you do any logging, the result is that the watersheds are severely damaged, and so you get severe erosion and massive floods in the lowland areas, because there's no longer that natural sponge to absorb the water from a typhoon when it goes through.
And that's already happening, Doc Larry, with the frequent rains, and the flood is the problem of flooding, particularly here in Metro Manila, is really terrible. So I think that's the consequence of all this logging, illegal logging.
Well, and for that matter, legal logging. I mean, much of it was, the fact is, much of it was very, very poorly managed for a long, long time. There probably is little little legal logging going on currently. There are very few logging concessions still operating. And right now, the bigger problem is the illegal logging. But historically, in terms of determining the situation that we're dealing with, the legal logging, much of it was bad. I mean, the photograph in the upper left there, that was a legal logging operation. That was perfectly legal, and yet it was horribly destructive.
During the time of the Marcos regime, there was a lot of balding of mountains because of the timber harvests, and these were all legalized by the government. That's why.
Yep.
So a way to encourage research on mammals, mammal research in the Philippines. Dr. Larry, I know we have a lot of students who are now interested in taking masteral courses, but what else can we say to them and to the rest of the other Filipinos?
Well, Letty, you're very familiar with the people who we work with overall, and the number of young people who are awfully excited about getting involved in all of this now. And that's a tremendously positive factor in all of this. In fact, can you go to the next slide? I think I put one in here. So in the late 80s, during the tail end of the Marcos era, there was very little support, very little opportunity to do any sort of wildlife-related research, biodiversity-related research. Very few people doing it. When we organized a meeting of people who work on birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians at Silliman University in 1992, we could come, including people who were professionals, who were at the faculty at universities or working in museums, or professionals working for conservation organizations, studying conservation of vertebrate animals, we could come up with about 28 people in 1992. That meeting led to the formation of what we then called the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines, now renamed as the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. And we went from that original, 26 or whatever people, to now having meetings that include typically 200 to 300 every year. There are, I've lost track, probably over 1,000 members of the society. Yeah. That to me is the most positive possible factor that one can point to for the future of biodiversity in the Philippines. There are just a tremendous number of people who are actively engaged in this now, very excited about it and contributing, doing all sorts of interesting research, developing new management techniques, getting information out to the general public about all of these issues, just doing all of the things that you can imagine that are going to help to make things better. And they are, it's tough. It's a rough situation. There are a lot of problems. But I would say that, aside from the ups and downs that we see, inevitably things are getting better for the environment and for biodiversity in the Philippines. Yes, there are problems, but now there are lots and lots and lots of people who are dealing with them. And that's a great thing to see.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Dr. Larry, it's indeed a very great opportunity for all our listeners to listen to you and learn about this endemic species of mammals in our country, and could serve as our pride, and maybe really influence a lot of people to protect more our environment. And so since we are nearing the end of our episode, Dr. Larry, Dr. Letty has written a poem for you, especially for you, and she's going to read it now. Doc Letty, our token of appreciation for our guest, Dr. Larry Heaney.
This is from our heart, Dr. Larry. We love all our guests, so we give them tokens of poetry. And since you can't understand our mother tongue, we have to do it in your mother tongue. So here it goes. The Philippines, Galapagos Islands times 10. The Philippines' biodiversity is truly amazing as scientist expeditions continue discovering many new endemic species never before seen in the last 4 decades. The counts kept on increasing. Mammals focused in today's Kwentong Likasiaman are our guests' unraveled discoveries since 1981. In the yearly expeditions to mountains and islands, over 40 species are described and names were given. The Negaunee curator of mammals is Dr. Lawrence Heaney, a scientist and educator at the Field Museum of Natural History. He also cares for the research collections, exhibits, and gallery specialized in mammal biology and evolution of biological diversity. When he rediscovered the Greater Dwarf Cloud in 2011, he described Philippine biodiversity as Galapagos times 10. Carpomis melanurus for 112 years has not been seen or known. Mount Pulag's 2350 MASL Mossy Mountain Forest was its very, very safe home. Among those special findings are earthworm mice. They are murids but have very selective love for crawling types. 5 genera with 40 species include Crotomys whiteheadi, Arcboldomys, Soricomys, Apomys, Rhynchomys are the likes. Also, Cloud rats, whose counts used to be only less than 10. There are now 5 in genera with 21 species that have dwarfs and giants. Crateromys schadenbergi and Phloemys are the big ones. Small ones are Carpomys phaeurus, Batomys grantii, and Museromys volantang. The second to the smallest in the Benga Diversity's global lists, the mammals in every island attest to high richness of species. Each faunal set detached by time and space have become endemic. The oceanic, archipelagic, and sky island fauna are truly unique. Country species counts and area ratio rise above any other one. The small Philippines is a globally important biodiversity haven. Each of the big islands is made up of many sky islands. Mountain ranges have distinct forest habitats for animals and plants. But proud as we may of the country's highest diversity treasures, we are aware of habitat loss, overcollection, and other pressures. They could all disappear in the face of climate change and human threat. If they are left unprotected, this richness will forever vanish. But thanks to Dr. Haney, whose love for discovery is overwhelming, whose dedication to science and conservation is compelling, we thank you for upholding the mammal diversity of the Philippines to uncover, protect, and sustain the mammals and habitats therein. Thank you so much, Dr. Larry Haney.
Thank you, Doc Letty, for that poem. And now at this point, we would like to request Doc Larry to give his last message for our listeners in Kwentong Likasiaman.
Well, first I need to thank Letty for that very kind poem, very generous. So I guess I would simply say that I am extremely grateful to my friends and colleagues in the Philippines and to everyone in the Philippines for all of the hospitality that I have been shown during my time there. It's been a wonderful thing to be involved. Fantastic to get to know so many great people and see so many good things happening. Being part of a community of people is as important to scientists as it is to anyone else. And I feel very privileged to have been part of a very large, energetic, and very pleasant community of biodiversity, biodiversity scientists, managers, and educators. It's been a wonderful thing for me, and I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to work with you on these things. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doc Larry. We are indeed very pleased that you were able to share your findings here in the country, and I hope that our country will be appreciative enough to really protect what we have, our riches, our natural resources, and there's still time to really do a lot more conservation efforts, no, to achieve our goal of having the next generation also experience this vast richness of our country. So with that, we are saying goodbye to our listeners till the next episode of Kwentong Likasiaman.